All right, let's jump right in. Today on The Explainer, we're diving into some absolutely fascinating core philosophies and spiritual inquiries brought up by a creator named Yasmin on her YouTube channel just to see what happens. We're going to explore her central thesis, and honestly, it's a pretty radical reexamination of spirituality, biology, and history. She asks this incredible question: what actually is God once you strip away all the religion, the culture, and those stories we've all been handed? Yasmin argues that if God is the ultimate source of life, that pure energy of creation, well, then the female body is literally the closest physical representation we have to that divine force. It's a lot to unpack, so we're going to break down exactly how history, power, and mythology totally shifted our understanding of this over the millennia. Okay, let's dive into this because this quote right here, this really sets the stage for our whole discussion. The side of God you were taught to fear. Just let that sink in for a second. Yasmin uses this incredibly powerful phrase to describe how feminine attributes have been historically, well, sidelined, and in many cases, completely demonized. We're looking at this really deep intellectual debate between the idea of a suppressed feminine divine and the historical orthodox power structures that eventually kind of bulldozed over it. Because according to Yasmin, this wasn't just some random, accidental cultural shift, no. It was a systemic, calculated reprogramming of what human society deemed sacred. So, moving into part one, defining the divine source, looking at biology and theology. To really wrap our heads around this, we first need to look at how Yasmin maps the actual physical reality of human creation onto our theological concepts of a creator. She points out something super interesting. When people have deep, mystical, or near-death experiences, they almost always describe the divine using words like unconditional love, empathy, profound care, oneness, basically traditionally nurturing feminine traits. In this view, the female body is essentially a portal, right? Taking literally nothing and turning it into something, a soul. Now contrast that with the historical, male-authored version of the divine that, let's be honest, most of us inherited. That God is modeled heavily after the ruling class, authoritative, distant, hierarchical, and, well, explicitly male. Yasmin poses a really sharp question here. If men wrote the history, wouldn't it make complete sense that their version of God would look exactly like them? Now, what's really interesting here is how Yasmin completely reframes biological reality. I mean, for centuries, these exact traits were used as ammunition to label women as overly emotional or, just irrational. But Yasmin presents them as actual tangible evidence of a defined connection. The female body's inherent connection to nature, the alignment with lunar cycles, that deep emotional capacity to build community. She argues there's no way these are weaknesses. Even heightened female intuition is framed here not as something spooky or magical, but as this incredibly powerful evolutionary gift of perception and nonverbal awareness. They're basically physical manifestations of that nurturing source energy. So the big question is, if these traits are so fundamentally tied to the literal creation of life, how on earth did they become something society feared and actively repressed? Let's trace exactly why and how this massive shift happened. Which brings us to part two. Matriarchy versus hierarchical power, the historical fracture. Tracing this historical fracture, Yasmin outlines a really clear structural shift. Back in the ancient era, early human societies actually often practiced matriarchal, earth-based religions. But then, as humanity transitioned into the agricultural era, things changed. Society started organizing around conquering, hierarchy, and this brand new concept, property. And think about it. When property and inheritance become the whole foundation of your society, tracking your male lineage becomes absolutely paramount. You have to know whose is whose. And to guarantee that lineage, society had to implement incredibly strict, calculated control over women's bodies and sexuality. This domino effect eventually led straight into the classical and medieval eras, where female autonomy was completely demonized, all to prop up the newly established patriarchal hierarchy we see in the modern era. But Yasmin is really keen to highlight the spiritual cost of that shift. Before this fracture, those early Earth-based religions, they viewed the planet as a mother to be respected, not just some infinite resource to be exploited and mined. Spirituality wasn't this rigid, top-down hierarchy governed by some distant, untouchable authority figure. It was deeply communal. The physical body itself was actually considered a sacred temple. Spirituality was something you experienced physically through movement, touch, dance, rather than just, conceptually up in your head. All right, part three, the mythology of control and weaponizing archetypes. So here's the thing. You can't just forcefully alter the entire structure of a society without also changing its stories. It just doesn't work. To maintain this new hierarchical power structure, the ruling class basically needed to rewrite the fundamental myths of human existence. Yasmin breaks down how Orthodox texts deliberately weaponized mythological women to justify male rationality and suppress female power. Look at Lilith. In Jewish mysticism, she demanded autonomy, and she was labeled a literal demon for it. Then you have Eve, who simply exhibited curiosity and a desire for knowledge. And bam, she's blamed as a source of original sin, the literal fall of mankind. And then there's Mary, who is presented as the ultimate yet completely impossible standard, perfectly obedient, silent, and entirely stripped of her sexuality. Guys, these aren't just old bedtime stories. They're a highly effective psychological framework designed to control behavior. I mean, this quote about Lilith really stops you right in your tracks. The first woman in history to ever say no to a man was also the first demon in history. Yasmin points out that Lilith simply refused to lie beneath Adam and chose to leave heaven rather than submit. The fact that the texts later describe her as a monster, well, it's highly revealing, isn't it? It suggests that society's historical fear of female pleasure, freedom, and autonomy is at its absolute core a profound fear of female power. And as Yasmin notes, this totally echoes into our modern day. Powerful, autonomous women are still frequently vilified in our culture. And to kind of fix the perceived problems of the autonomous Lilith and the curious Eve, the archetype of Mary was elevated. But this created an absolute, impossible paradox for women. The underlying message was basically, you must be a mother and create life, but you absolutely must not enjoy it. Your pleasure is sinful, your natural cycles are shameful and need to be hidden away, you are commanded to be numb, quiet, and pure. It effectively demanded that women fulfill their biological role while simultaneously stripping them of their autonomy and really their humanity. And the historical consequences of these myths were severe, very tangible. Curiosity, which, by the way, is the exact trait that all of philosophy and science are built upon, was severely punished in women. Knowledge was heavily restricted. Women who gathered to heal each other, or exchange information, or just build community, they were labeled witches and literally hunted down. Yasmin explains that society very carefully separated female communities and actively pitted women against one another. Why? Because unified, strong, intelligent women posed a massive, direct threat to the established hierarchical order. Women were quite literally taught to make themselves smaller. Which brings us to our final section, Part 4, Reclaiming Feared Feminine Energy, the synthesis. So where does this leave all of us today? How do we actually synthesize this deep historical fracture? Well, Yasmin's ultimate conclusion asks us to look at how we treat these suppressed traits in our own modern lives. And the crucial point here, this is absolutely key, is that this isn't just a men versus women thing. Yasmin is talking about yin, feminine energy. Things like empathy, intuition, softness, care. These are universal traits. They exist in all human beings, totally regardless of gender. Yasmin argues that the real tragedy of this historical shift is that the feminine wasn't just repressed in women, it was heavily and often violently repressed in men, too. We ended up creating a society almost entirely obsessed with logic, dominance, and power, which left all of us deeply disconnected from a vital, beautiful aspect of our shared humanity. Ultimately, the feminine isn't your opposite. Reclaiming these traits isn't about opposing the masculine or swinging the pendulum wildly to the other extreme. Actually, scratch that. It's more like it's about dismantling the hierarchical disconnect altogether. The disconnect that tricked us into believing that empathy, softness, and care were somehow weaknesses, when in fact they might just be the absolute closest things we have to the divine. It's really about all of us becoming whole again. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to reflect on. How has your own perception of power, of divinity, and even of your own body been shaped by the stories you inherited? Are you still operating under those inherited fears, or are you ready to get curious about the side of yourself you were taught to suppress? Take a moment to really think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today, and as always, keep asking questions.
So, picture the most famous depiction of divine creation in the Western world. Just imagine you're standing right in the middle of the Sistine Chapel, looking up at Michelangelo's masterpiece.
Oh, yeah. The creation of Adam.
Exactly. On the right side of the fresco, you've got God. And, like, what does God actually look like in that painting? He's this powerfully built older man, flowing white beard, wrapped in that swirling cloak, and he's reaching out with this incredibly authoritative, muscular arm.
Right, floating up in the sky,
Yeah.
totally suspended above the earth.
Yeah, exactly. Suspended above everything. And then on the left side, you have Adam just reclining on the dirt, basically waiting to be given the spark of life. And I mean, it is a stunning piece of art, obviously.
Oh, for sure.
But if you stare at it long enough, you start to realize how heavily that specific image has just programmed our baseline understanding of reality. For millennia, our culture, our orthodoxies, our art, they've all reinforced this exact dynamic, that the source of life is a distant, distinctly male figure who, creates from above, dictates order, and exists completely separate from the messy, earthly reality we actually live in.
Yeah, we're so used to the guy in the sky that we don't even question if there's another way to conceptualize the universe.
Right.
It functions almost like a psychological default setting. The entire architectural layout of our spiritual imagination has been blueprinted by that specific archetype.
Wow, yeah. The architectural layout. I like that.
Right. Because we assume, almost subconsciously, that ultimate power just has to be hierarchical. It must be transcendent, meaning it sits outside of nature looking down. And it has to be fundamentally paternal. When a concept is that deeply embedded in the soil of a culture, you don't even see it as theology anymore. You just see it as the water you're swimming in.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive, because we are stepping entirely outside of that traditional architecture today. We're pulling from some really fascinating insights, a philosophical framework presented by a thinker named Yasmin.
From her YouTube channel, right?
Yes, the channel is called Just to See What Happens. And she has put forward this highly provocative, radical critique that she calls the divinity of the feminine. And she's basically asking us to completely invert that Sistine Chapel dynamic.
It's a massive structural inversion. I mean, Yasmin is arguing that if we actually want to find the closest physical representation of the ultimate source of life, we really shouldn't be looking up at a patriarchal figure in the clouds.
Right.
We should be looking at the female body. Furthermore, she makes this historical argument that the feminine attributes we see in the world, things like deep intuition, communal care, softness, they aren't secondary or submissive traits.
Like we're always taught they are.
Exactly. She argues they are actually the ultimate divine traits. She calls them the side of God you were taught to fear.
The side of God you were taught to fear. Man, that is such a heavy phrase. But before we go any further, I do want to make our parameters for this conversation crystal clear for you listening. We are diving into Yasmin's philosophical, historical, and mythological interpretations today as a really fascinating lens through which to view human history.
Right, exploration.
Exactly. We aren't treating this as absolute, unassailable theological or political truth. Our goal is to impartially examine her critique, to, trace how ancient matriarchal systems might have been replaced by patriarchal hierarchies.
Yeah, and to understand the mechanics of how human societies build their concepts of power in the first place.
Exactly. We're here to unpack the source material because it challenges some of our oldest assumptions, and honestly, that is always where the best discoveries happen.
The value of an intellectual exercise like this lies precisely in the friction it creates with our established norms. By investigating her thesis, we're basically forced to ask critical questions about how historical narratives are constructed, right? Like, who gets to write those narratives, and what alternative ways of viewing the world might have been just intentionally buried along the way.
So if we wipe the slate clean, if we literally paint over the frescoes, roll up the ancient scrolls written by ruling kings and early church fathers, what does the source of life actually look like in the physical, tangible world?
Right, back to basics.
Yeah. Yasmin starts her entire framework by completely redefining the word God. She completely strips away the anthropomorphic cultural baggage. She doesn't define the divine as a king on a throne or a judge with a ledger of sins. She defines it purely as the energy of creation, the literal raw power that possesses the capacity to turn nothing into something.
Which fundamentally changes the trajectory of the whole inquiry.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you define the divine as an external monarch, you study the divine by looking at the rules of the kingdom, right? But if you define the divine as the sheer kinetic energy of existence, that crazy leap from non-being to being, then you have to look at the mechanics of the physical world to find it. You have to ask, where in our observable reality do we actually witness the impossible transition of nothingness becoming life?
And her answer to that is what anchors this entire theory. She draws a direct, undeniable biological link. She points out that every single prophet, every conqueror, every philosopher, every genius who has ever existed in the history of the human race entered this physical realm in the exact same way.
Through the body of a woman.
There is zero exception to this. So Yasmin argues that the female body isn't just a biological vessel. It acts as a literal physical portal from the unknown. It is the very threshold where the energy of creation actually materializes.
It's just a fascinating attempt to bridge a dualism that Western philosophy has kept fiercely divided for centuries.
What do you mean by dualism in this context?
Well, think back to Descartes or even earlier Platonic thought. We have always been taught to split reality into two camps. You have the spirit, the mind, the transcendent, and that is the high, holy, pure stuff.
Right, the stuff in the sky.
Exactly. And then you have the body, the flesh, the earth, the biological, and that is the low, mundane, corruptible stuff.
Yeah.
Yasmin is collapsing that wall completely.
Tearing it down.
Yeah. She's suggesting that the physical capacity to gestate life is intrinsically tied to divine creation. The biology is not separate from the theology. The biology is the theology playing out in real time. The female body becomes the localized, physical manifestation of that universal creative engine.
I'm trying to visualize how different that is from our standard model of creation. It makes me think of the difference between a sculptor and a seed.
Ooh, I like that. Break that down.
Okay, so in the patriarchal model, God is the sculptor.
Yeah.
The sculptor stands outside the lump of clay. He's totally separate from it. He uses his hands, his tools, his external force to mold the clay into a shape he desires. It is creation through external imposition.
Right? An artisanal model of creation. The creator is forever alienated from the artifact.
Exactly. But Yasmin's model, tied to the feminine, is entirely internal. It operates like a seed planted in the earth. The creator is not standing outside the creation, hammering it into shape. The creation is growing within the creator.
It's gestational.
Gestational, exactly. The boundaries between the maker and the made are totally blurred. It's a highly intimate biological fusion. And that changes the entire definition of what divine power looks like. It stops being about force and starts being about holding space.
And if you extrapolate that gestational model outward, it profoundly recontextualizes how we view feminine traits on a spiritual level. Yasmin takes this biological reality of the portal and she maps it onto the psychology of spiritual experiences.
Yeah, she talks about near-death experiences, right?
Yeah, near-death experiences or deep mystical encounters across various global traditions. When human beings describe touching the ultimate source or brushing up against the divine, they rarely describe encountering a stern, rational administrator holding a rulebook.
Right, they never say they met a guy doing their taxes.
Exactly. They almost universally describe a sensation of overwhelming, unconditional love. They describe profound empathy, a feeling of deep oneness, of being held, and of infinite nurturing.
Which are the exact traits that our society has biologically and historically assigned to women.
That is the glaring discrepancy she wants us to look at. Just think about how a modern, hierarchical, capitalistic society views the concept of nurturing.
Oh, it's totally dismissed.
Right? It's coded as soft, it's domestic, it's secondary. It is the unpaid labor expected in the home, but it certainly isn't the trait you look for in a Fortune 500 CEO or a military general.
Yeah, it's seen as a liability in those spaces.
Exactly. Yet, in the realm of mysticism, that exact same quality of nurturing, of holding, of boundless empathy is considered the absolute highest spiritual reality. The traits that our socioeconomic structures devalue as merely feminine are the very traits that our spiritual traditions describe as the ultimate divine embrace.
She pushes this even further by reframing the concept of female intuition, which I think is so cool. I find this part so critical because intuition is constantly downplayed.
Oh, all the time.
It's treated like a magic trick or a mystical trope or even a punchline. Oh, that's just her female intuition acting up. But Yasmin strips away the mystical woo-woo and frames it as a profound evolutionary gift. She argues it's an incredibly acute power of perception.
Like a supercomputer processing background data.
Exactly. It's the ability to instantaneously read nonverbal cues, microexpressions, shifts in energy, and environmental data. And she points out that historically, this was the essential technology required for building and sustaining human community.
Because it fundamentally is a different metric of intelligence. Our standard Western metric for intelligence is usually highly individualized, analytical, and linear. Can you solve this equation? Can you build this tool? Can you isolate the variables? But intuition is relational intelligence. It's a highly sophisticated subconscious processing system. It requires taking in massive amounts of subtle, emotional, and environmental data all at once, synthesizing it instantly, and using it to maintain the harmony and survival of the group.
Wow.
So if you accept the premise that the divine is fundamentally about oneness and connection, then the specific type of intelligence that connects people's intuition has to be viewed as a deeply divine trait.
Okay, I need to pause here and throw a massive wrench into this on behalf of, well, just on behalf of Disc Logic.
Go for it.
Whenever anyone ties spiritual superiority or philosophical frameworks so tightly to physical biology, we run straight into the brick wall of biological essentialism.
Yes, the classic trap.
Right. Because if divinity is tied to the physical female body, to the literal womb, to the physical act of giving birth, to menstruation and gestation, doesn't this framework alienate a massive portion of humanity?
It's a very valid question.
Like, what about women who cannot have children? Women who choose not to? What about trans individuals? Does Yasmin's framework accidentally create a new restrictive biological hierarchy while she's trying to dismantle the old patriarchal one?
That is the most critical vulnerability in any philosophy that anchors itself in the physical body, and it requires us to look very closely at the mechanics of her argument. While she uses the physical reality of the female body as the starting point, the literal portal as you delve deeper into her thesis, it becomes clear she is utilizing the female body as the ultimate physical archetype for what Eastern philosophy would call yin energy.
Yin energy, okay.
Yeah. She explicitly states later in her framework that this feminine energy, this yin, lives in everyone, regardless of gender or biological sex.
So you're saying she's using the biology as a metaphor for a psychological state?
Well, more than just a metaphor, she sees it as a fractal reality. The physical biology of gestation is the material expression of a universal metaphysical principle. The portal isn't just a literal uterus. The portal represents a mode of being in the world. It is the capacity for profound receptivity. It's the ability to gestate ideas, to nurture growth in others, to synthesize emotional data, and to bring the unknown into the known.
Oh, I love that. Gestating ideas.
Right. Everyone has access to this. A man has the capacity for yin energy. A woman who never has children has immense capacity for this generative, connective power. The female body is simply the most overt biological blueprint of this universal spiritual truth.
All right, that distinction helps immensely because it moves us away from a rigid biological caste system and into a conversation about energies and archetypes.
Exactly.
But it also leads directly to the massive historical contradiction at the center of all this. If this feminine power of internal creation, of deep connective intuition, and of nurturing is truly reflective of the highest divine reality, why does our modern world seem to hate it so much?
It's the million-dollar question.
Or, to use Yasmin's phrasing, why are we taught to fear it?
And that brings us to the historical pivot. To understand why we fear it now, Yasmin insists we have to understand how we were programmed to fear it in the past.
Yeah.
Because her argument is that the human operating system wasn't always configured this way.
She points back to early matriarchal societies and early goddess-worshipping religions, and she sketches out a reality that is almost unrecognizable to a modern citizen.
Totally alien to us.
Right. In these ancient frameworks, the Earth was not viewed as dead matter. It wasn't a warehouse of resources waiting to be extracted, mined, and sold. The Earth was literally viewed as a living mother, and the physical human body wasn't something corrupt that you had to be ashamed of or whip into submission. It was a sacred temple.
Yeah.
Sexuality was not a sin to be hidden. It was recognized as a divine, highly potent, creative force.
And the mechanism of spiritual practice was entirely different. We touched on this earlier, but it's vital. In a patriarchal framework, spirituality is often transcendent and intellectualized.
You mean like sitting in a church?
Yes. You sit perfectly still in a pew, you read a sacred text, you recite a creed, and you look up at the sky. It is about the mind mastering the body. But in the ancient matriarchal models Yasmin references, spirituality was embodied.
Embodied.
You didn't just read about the divine, you danced it. You experienced it through rhythmic movement, through the physical cycles of the moon and the harvest, through touch, through communal ritual. The divine was found down here, in the dirt, in the flesh, in the immediate present.
So the obvious question is like, what broke? How do you go from a society that worships the earth, reveres the female body, and values communal intuition, to a society that builds towering hierarchical structures, represses the body, and places a patriarchal rulemaker in the clouds?
Right, it's a huge leap.
Yasmin points to a very specific structural shift in human development. She argues the pivot wasn't a theological accident, it was an economic inevitability. It was the shift toward hierarchy, the desire for conquering, and this is the big one, the invention of private property.
This is where anthropology and theology violently collide. If you look at the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from nomadic, egalitarian, hunter-gatherer bands to settled agrarian societies, everything changes.
Because of farming, right.
Exactly. The moment you invent the plow, the moment you can generate a surplus of grain, and the moment you build a fence to say, this land is mine, you have created the concept of private wealth.
And once you have private wealth, you have to figure out what to do with it when you die. You have the invention of inheritance.
Yes. And the economic implications of inheritance are staggering when you really map them out. In a communal hunter-gatherer society, resources are shared. Lineage is often traced through the mother, because maternity is always obvious. You always know who a child's mother is.
Right.
But paternity. Before modern genetics, paternity was fundamentally uncertain.
Oh, wow. I see where the gears start turning here. Because if you are a powerful patriarch in an agrarian society, and you've amassed herds of cattle and acres of fenced-in land, you want to pass that wealth down to your biological sons. But how do you guarantee with absolute certainty that the boy inheriting your empire is actually your biological offspring?
There is only one way to guarantee paternity in the ancient world. You have to enact absolute, unyielding control over the reproductive capacity of women.
God, that's dark.
It is. In a system built on male inheritance and the accumulation of private property, female autonomy, specifically female sexual autonomy, is no longer just a cultural difference. It becomes a direct existential threat to the entire economic order.
Because if they aren't controlled, the property gets split up.
Exactly. If women are sexually free, the lines of inheritance collapse. The wealth dissipates. Therefore, to consolidate and protect the new economic system, the systems of power had to subjugate women's bodies.
The mechanics of that are chilling. I want to build an analogy to really lock in how massive this psychological operation was.
Let's hear it.
Okay, imagine the entire span of early human history is a giant corporation. Let's call it Earth Inc.
Earth Inc. Okay.
For a very long time, Earth Inc. operates as a flat, horizontal cooperative. The company culture is focused on sustainability. The board of directors is communal. The primary assets of the company are intuition, shared resources, and environmental harmony. But then a rogue group of shareholders invents the concept of private property, and they stage a massive hostile takeover.
What happens when a new management team stages a hostile takeover? They don't just change the locks on the doors.
Right.
They have to rewrite the entire corporate culture so that the employees accept the new hierarchy as the natural order of things.
Yes. They realize that the old company assets, female autonomy, embodied spirituality, communal intuition, they are a direct threat to their new profit model of control and inheritance. So the new management launches the most extensive, brutal, millennia-long public relations campaign in the history of the world.
A global PR campaign.
Exactly. And the goal of this PR campaign is to completely rebrand the former company's greatest strengths as toxic radioactive liabilities. They have to convince the entire human race that the old way of doing things wasn't just economically inefficient, they have to convince them it was literally evil.
And because history, in this case theology, is written by the victors of the hostile takeover, the new management gets to redesign the ultimate company logo. They have to recast the concept of God.
They write God in their own image.
Precisely. If the new social order is based on a male patriarch ruling over his land, dominating nature and dictating laws to his subordinates, then the ultimate authority in the universe must look exactly the same. God becomes a distant, authoritative, hierarchical male ruling from above.
It's a mirror.
The theology becomes a mirror for the economics. Because if God is a hierarchical patriarch who demands strict obedience and punishes the flesh, then it is only natural, in fact, it is a divine mandate, that human society should be structured the exact same way. The economic subjugation of the feminine is legitimized by theological doctrine.
That makes terrifying sense. But it brings us to the operational phase of this ancient PR campaign. Because it's one thing to say, we need to control women so we can control our property, but you can't just announce that. People would rebel.
Right, you need a narrative.
How do you actually psychologically condition generations of people to fear the literal portal of life? How do you make women police themselves? Yasmin argues that the new management didn't just use swords, they used stories. They encoded this new system of control into the foundational myths that we still use to shape our worldview today.
The mythological blueprint for control. It is arguably the most effective form of psychological conditioning ever invented. Yasmin points out that to justify the systemic subjugation of women, the female body had to be framed not just as inferior, but as the ultimate metaphysical source of sin, chaos, and impurity.
It's brilliant in a really evil way.
It is. She highlights 3 specific archetypes that were weaponized to build this narrative architecture: Eve, Lilith, and the Virgin Mary.
Let's start with Eve, because she is the cornerstone of the Western narrative. And Yasmin also draws a brilliant parallel to the Greek myth of Pandora. If you look at the fundamental crime of both Eve and Pandora, like, what did they actually do?
Right. What was the actual crime?
Pandora opened a jar. Eve ate a piece of fruit from a tree. At their core, both of these women were simply curious.
They sought knowledge. They sought to understand what was hidden from them. And Yasmin highlights the profound, staggering irony here. Think about what curiosity is.
It's everything.
It is the engine of human progress. It is the catalyst for philosophy, for science, for exploration, for every leap forward our species has ever made. It is arguably our greatest cognitive asset. And yet, in these foundational myths, when curiosity is expressed by a woman, it is instantly demonized as the catastrophic act that ruins paradise, unleashes disease, and brings suffering and death to all of humanity.
I am struggling to wrap my head around the hypocrisy of this. Historically, men have constantly praised curiosity, ambition, and the pursuit of knowledge in themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
You look at male explorers, male philosophers, scientists, conquerors. They are universally celebrated as heroes for pushing boundaries and demanding answers. Why was there such a deep existential terror of those exact same traits when they were exhibited by women? I mean, was it purely just about protecting property inheritance, or was it a deeper, almost primal fear of losing control over the biological portal of life?
It's undoubtedly a synthesis of both. The economic necessity of controlling inheritance provided the cold, structural motive. But the psychological terror of the unknown provided the emotional fuel for the myth.
What do you mean by the terror of the unknown?
Remember, ancient men did not understand the mechanics of gestation. The female body was a profound mystery. It bled in rhythm with the moon. It swelled, and life emerged from it. There was a deep psychological intimidation in facing a power you do not possess and cannot fully comprehend.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
So how does a patriarchal system handle that intimidation? Through rigid codification. Men were culturally codified as the bearers of reason, order, autonomy, and intellect. By necessity of contrast, women had to be codified as irrational, hyper-emotional, chaotic, and inherently dangerous.
It's a binary.
Yes. The narrative had to be. Look what happened when Eve was left to her own devices. She destroyed the world. Therefore, women cannot be trusted with autonomy. They must be governed by the rational minds of men.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the story of Lilith, which might be one of the most revealing myths Yasmin brings up. For those who aren't familiar, Lilith does not show up in the standard Genesis narrative most people read in Sunday Sup.
Right, she's excluded from the mainstream canon.
She is a figure from Jewish mythology and mysticism, famously detailed in texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira. The story goes that Lilith was actually the first woman. She wasn't made from Adam's rib after the fact. She was created at the exact same time as Adam from the exact same earth.
A completely egalitarian origin story.
Right. And because they were created equal, Lilith refused to be subordinate to Adam. The texts are incredibly literal about this. They say she refused to lie beneath him during intimacy. She demanded equality. And when Adam refused to treat her as an equal, Lilith didn't apologize. She didn't submit. She spoke the ineffable name of God and literally flew away from the Garden of Eden.
She just left.
She abandoned paradise rather than accept subjugation. And what happened to her in the ensuing mythology? She was relentlessly demonized. She was transformed in the cultural consciousness into a night demon, a succubus, a monster who steals babies in the dark.
It's such a brutal transformation.
Yasmin has this quote that just hit me like a ton of bricks. The first woman in history to ever say no to a man was also the first demon in history.
Wow. It is the absolute perfect illustration of how patriarchal structures handle the threat of female autonomy. Look at the mechanics of the Lilith story. When a woman sets a clear boundary when she says, I was made from the same earth, I will not be subordinate, the systemic response is never negotiation. It is never compromise or self-reflection. The systemic response is total, unmitigated demonization. She is cast out of polite society, stripped of her humanity, and literally turned into a monster used to frighten children. The myth of Lilith, serves as a terrifying warning sign posted on the perimeter of female independence.
Like a keep-out sign.
Exactly. It sends a very clear cultural message. To assert your equality is to align yourself with demonic evil.
So if you are a woman living under this new psychological regime, look at the archetypes you were given. You have Eve, the curious sinner whose desire for knowledge ruined humanity. You have Lilith, the autonomous rebel who demanded equality and was turned into a literal monster. That creates a massive PR problem for the new management, right?
A huge problem.
You have convinced women they are inherently flawed, chaotic, and dangerous. But you still need them to function within the society. You need them to bear the children and maintain the homes. You need to give them an approved role model, an ideal to aspire to that perfectly serves the hierarchical system. And Yasmin argues that this is the exact psychological void that the Virgin Mary was elevated to fill. She was the systemic fix for the Eve and Lilith problem.
And we have to deeply analyze what a complex, brilliantly insidious fix it is. Because Mary is revered, yes. She is elevated to the status of the Queen of Heaven. But look at the specific parameters of her reverence. What makes her holy? What is the standard she sets?
Well, it's a standard built on complete physical and psychological paradoxes. First, she achieves the biological impossible. She creates life. She gestates the divine, but she does it entirely without human sexuality. The messy, chaotic, quote-unquote, sinful reality of physical conception is completely removed from the equation. She maintains absolute purity. And second, if you look at the biblical narrative, particularly the Gospel of Luke, her defining characteristic is radical submission. When told what is going to happen to her body, her response is, "Let it be to me according to your word." She is largely silent, perfectly obedient, and completely passive.
Exactly. She's revered not for her agency, but for her lack of it. She's the perfectly passive, sanitized vessel for a male god's agenda. She possesses no messy human sexuality, no rebellious curiosity like Eve, no demand for boundary setting like Lilith. She is holy precisely because she has been stripped of the very traits that define complex, messy, autonomous human agency.
And the psychological trap is that it sets an utterly unattainable standard for real flesh and blood women. You are told to emulate Mary, but you can't be a mother without sexuality. You can't navigate the world without curiosity or boundaries.
It's rigged from the start.
Yes. So by design, every single real woman will inevitably fail to meet the Marian standard. And because you constantly fall short of this impossible ideal of purity and silent obedience, you remain in a perpetual state of guilt, forever requiring the guidance, forgiveness, and authority of the patriarchal system to redeem you. It is a closed-loop system of psychological control.
It is the ultimate double-bind. The Madonna-whore dichotomy cemented into theology. You are either the impossibly pure, silent mother, or you are the dangerous, curious, rebellious demon. There is no archetypal space left for a whole, complex human being.
And we have to transition from the mythology to the real-world historical brutality, because this framing didn't just stay neatly tucked away in illuminated manuscripts. People believed these myths.
Oh, they acted on them.
Big time. And when a society deeply believes that female autonomy, intuition, and community are inherently dangerous and tied to demonic forces, well, it leads to Yasmin's exploration of the severing of community and the systemic rebranding of weakness. She talks specifically about the historical removal of knowledge from women, because for centuries, women were the primary healers.
Yes.
They gathered, they shared deep empirical knowledge about childbirth, they understood herbalism, they provided contraception, they created powerful, localized networks of care. They were the glue of the community.
And what were those women called when the hierarchical systems, both the burgeoning medical establishments and the religious authorities, decided to consolidate their power?
They were called wishes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The concept of the witch is perhaps the most misunderstood historical phenomenon we have, and is vital to Yasmin's thesis. We've been conditioned by pop culture to think of witches as supernatural villains, women making pacts with the devil, cackling over cauldrons.
Like Halloween costumes.
Right. But if you look at it from a sociological and economic perspective, especially during the transition from feudalism to early capitalism, the witch was an incredible threat to the new management.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of why a village healer was a threat to a massive hierarchy.
Because she represented a node of power that existed entirely outside the control of the church and the state. Think about what a midwife or an herbalist possessed. She possessed independent knowledge of the human body and nature. She facilitated community organizing. If she had knowledge of contraception or abortifacients, she had literal control over the labor supply, which was terrifying to states that needed growing populations for agriculture and warfare.
Wow, I never thought of it as labor supply.
It was all economics.
Yeah.
She was an authority figure who did not derive her authority from a male institution. Therefore, to centralize power, the institutions had to eliminate these localized, female-centric networks of care.
So the witch hunts, the publication of manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the tortures, the burnings. It wasn't just mass hysteria or religious superstition. It was a calculated, systemic strategy to physically and psychologically terrorize women into submission.
A targeted campaign.
It was designed to separate them, to make them view each other with suspicion, to pit them against one another. The goal was to destroy the fabric of female community. Because if you see your neighbor healing someone with herbs, and you know that if you don't report her, you might be tortured next, it shatters trust. It severs the connective tissue of intuition and care that Yasmin argues is divine.
Is the brutal enforcement of isolation. And Yasmin argues that the shockwaves of that historical trauma are still very much with us. Even today, in our modern culture, unified, intelligent, autonomous women organizing outside of male-approved structures are often viscerally perceived as a threat to the status quo.
The fallout from this systemic repression is just immense. Because the fall of the feminine didn't just harm women. Yasmin makes the point that it led to a widespread cultural sickness, a profound disconnection. The traits that were historically associated with the feminine empathy, deep intuition, softness, communal care, the capacity to just sit and hold space, they were systematically downgraded. They were rebranded from essential, life-sustaining survival skills into weaknesses.
And here is where we have to expand the scope, because this is the crux of why this matters for every single person listening. Yasmin is explicit that this is not just a women's issue. She uses the vocabulary of feminine and masculine, but as we discussed earlier, she's talking about yin and yang energies.
Right.
In Taoist philosophy, these forces are complementary and they exist in all things. Yang is the active, penetrating, logical, bright, forward-moving energy. Yin is the receptive, yielding, intuitive, dark, nurturing energy. You cannot have a healthy human being or healthy society without a balance of both.
But Yasmin is arguing that our global society has aggressively repressed the yin.
Exactly. And the repression of that yin energy harms men just as deeply, perhaps more silently, than it harms women. We have to analyze the psychological toll of this imbalance. What happens when a global culture equates softness with weakness? What happens when an entire society functions on the belief that half of the human emotional spectrum, the capacity for vulnerability, for stillness, for deep, non-transactional connection, is culturally devalued, or worse, shamed?
You get the world we live in right now. You get a society that is hyper-competitive, deeply isolated, and chronically anxious. You get massive rates of burnout. You get an economic system that treats the earth exactly the way it treats the female body, as something to be dominated, extracted, and controlled until it is exhausted.
Yeah.
You get a culture of constant, frantic doing at the total expense of simply being. It's like driving a car and pressing the accelerator to the floor forever while completely ripping out the brakes. The engine is going to explode.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy. The yang is the accelerator. The yin is the brakes, the coolant, the suspension. By demonizing the yin, we have built a society designed to redline until it breaks down. Men are taught from childhood to sever their connection to their own intuition, to swallow their empathy, and to define their worth entirely by their ability to conquer, provide, and dominate. They are cut off from their own internal divine nature.
Which prompts a very practical, highly urgent question. Let's say I'm listening to this right now. Let's say I completely buy into Yasmin's framework. I look at my life and I recognize that the modern world I inhabit, the corporate ladder I'm climbing, the political spheres I navigate, the daily grind of capitalism is entirely built on this hierarchical, male-centered, hyper-yang framework.
Because it is.
Right. The system rewards ruthlessness. It rewards endless expansion. It punishes vulnerability. So if I am an individual operating in that reality, how can I actually reclaim this divine softness and intuition without just getting eaten alive?
It is the most difficult challenge of applied philosophy.
Because honestly, telling someone to just be soft and intuitive in a modern corporate boardroom feels like telling someone to bring a single daisy to a sword fight. You're just going to get cut down. How does a person practically integrate this without becoming a victim of the hierarchy?
The answer requires a total redefinition of what softness actually is. In a patriarchal framework, softness is defined as fragility. It is yielding because you lack the strength to resist. But Yasmin offers a profound perspective shift. The kind of divine softness she's advocating for requires immense, unshakable internal security. It is about accessing a different kind of power. She ties this to a concept that the ancient Greeks called agape.
Agape, that's a specific type of love, right? Distinct from romantic love or brotherly love?
Yes, in Greek philosophy and theology, eros is romantic, passionate love, philia is brotherly, platonic love, but agape is the highest form. It is a universal, unconditional, selfless love.
Like an overflowing kind of love?
Exactly. It is an active choice to will the good of another. It is a love of total abundance that does not panic when faced with friction, scarcity, or hostility. Reclaiming the divinity of the feminine means operating from a place of agape.
So how does that translate to the sword fight of modern life?
It means you stop fighting on their terms. If you bring a sword to a sword fight, you are just perpetuating the yang hierarchy. You are agreeing that violence and domination are the only valid metrics of power. But if you bring the metaphorical flower, if you bring intuition, empathy, and agape love, you aren't being weak. You are refusing to play the game by the hierarchy's rules.
Oh, that's powerful.
True softness is the strength to remain open in a world that demands you armor up. It is the strength to listen to your intuition when the spreadsheets tell you to be ruthless. Water is soft, but over time, it cuts through solid rock. The hierarchy relies on your participation in its anxiety and its competition. When you refuse to panic, when you choose connection over conquest, you become incredibly disruptive to the system.
To illustrate this disruption on a granular level, Yasmin talks about her own daily practice. She actively, intentionally practices treating the women in her life and herself with what she calls love and devotion. She literally views them as goddesses, as localized portals for the mystical. And I want to dig into what that actually looks like on a Tuesday afternoon at the office.
Yeah, the practical application.
What are the mechanics of that? It looks like taking the cultural programming that tells women to constantly compete with one another and throwing it in the garbage.
It is shifting the default setting from competition to profound communal reverence.
Yes, it means when you walk into a room, instead of immediately scanning the other women and sizing them up as threats to your status, your desirability, or your career advancement, which is what the patriarchal PR campaign trained you to do, you consciously choose to see them as divine allies. You choose collaboration, you choose to mentor instead of undermine.
It is an act of quiet, radical rebellion. Every time you reclaim intuition and care as divine strengths rather than embarrassing weaknesses, you are actively dismantling the architecture of the hierarchy within your own life. You begin to build micro-communities based on trust, empathy, and shared knowledge.
You're rebuilding the networks.
Exactly, rebuilding the very networks that the witch hunts tried to destroy. And ironically, in a modern world that is starving to death for genuine non-transactional connection, that authenticity doesn't make you weak. It becomes a profound source of magnetism. It becomes a completely different, unassailable kind of power.
Okay, let's step back and look at the entire landscape we have covered today, because this is an incredible paradigm-shifting deep dive. Yasmin isn't just offering a feminist critique of ancient history here. She's not just complaining about unfair patriarchal structure.
It goes way deeper.
She is offering a full-scale spiritual reclamation. She is asking us to completely rip up the floorboards of how we see the world. She asks us to look at the female body, the biological capacity for gestation, and all the feminine traits that flow from it: intuition, care, empathy, community, and see them not as secondary, not as the source of original sin, and certainly not as weak. She is asking us to view them as the absolute closest earthly reflection of the ultimate creative force of the universe.
Yeah. It is a total shift from viewing the divine as an external dominating force that imposes order from above to recognizing the divine as an internal gestational force that nurtures, connects, and grows from within.
And the relevancy for you listening right now, whether you are driving your car or doing the dishes or sitting at a desk, is massive. Because regardless of your biology, whether you identify with the feminine or the masculine, whether you are a man, a woman, or non-binary, you carry this yin energy within you. You have this capacity.
It is in all of us.
Reclaiming the side of God you were taught to fear is a highly personal mission. It means finally giving yourself permission to value your own empathy. It means honoring your physical body, not as a machine to be optimized, but as a space of wisdom. It means following your natural curiosities without guilt. It means prioritizing your deep need for community, regardless of the relentless societal pressures telling you to be rigid, to be hyper-rational, to constantly compete, and to conquer everything in your path.
It is, at its core, an invitation to wholeness. It is a demand to integrate the shadow self, to unearth the parts of your humanity that the culture explicitly told you to bury in order to be considered strong or successful.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a brand new thought to mull over, something to take out into the world that builds on everything we discussed today. I want you to consider the physical architecture of the world around you. If you look at ancient prehistoric history, the spiritual sites that early humans built almost universally mirrored the feminine body. Think of the deep, echoing subterranean caves painted with ancient art. Think of earthen burial mounds. Think of the circular womb-like enclosures of places like Stonehenge, built directly into the earth, designed for communal gathering, and aligned perfectly with the cyclical movements of the moon and the sun.
Structures of integration, enclosures that hold space.
Exactly. Now, walk out your front door and look at the modern world we have built. Look at the skylines of our major cities. Look at our towering glass and steel skyscrapers. Look at the pointed steeples of our cathedrals. Look at our phallic monuments and obelisks. Our entire architectural language is based on thrusting upward, dominating the horizon, conquering the sky, and escaping the earth.
It is the literal physical manifestation of the shift from the circle to the spire, from the earth to the sky, from the yin to the yang.
So here's the question for you to take with you, to think about the next time you walk through your city. If our society were to truly, deeply re-embrace Yasmin's divinity of the feminine, if we somehow managed to overthrow the ancient PR campaign and once again valued the circle, the earth, the internal, and the community over the hierarchy, the sky, and the external domination, how would the very spaces we live in begin to change? What would a city built on the divinity of the feminine actually look like?
A truly fascinating thought experiment to end on. It asks us to imagine a world built for holding rather than a world built for conquering.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. I know we covered a massive amount of historical, theological, and psychological ground. We hope it sparked a new perspective for you. Keep questioning the ancient stories you've been handed, keep challenging the cultural default settings, and above all, stay curious. We will catch you on the next deep dive.